Ilya, thank you so much for joining me on Outlier Academy. I'm thrilled to have you on for a really deep dive into what you're building at Near with Near Protocol. Thank you so much for the
Thanks,
time.
Daniel. Yeah, thanks for inviting.
So I'd love to start because I want to frame up what Near is for everyone listening who maybe isn't familiar with it, just by talking about at a really high level what you're building. And one of the things I thought was interesting there is, there's the tagline that you guys, use sometimes is reimagining your world. What does that mean, and what are some of the really high level goals that you had with Near from day one?
So our kind of the highest level vision is to build a world where people control their assets, data, and power of governance. And so what this really means is kind of changing from the current state where there is a third party, either a government or a corporation, that is defining what you own, right? Let's say if you own some piece of land, there's a land aid kind of organization that is actually has a registry that says that you own it. Or, if it's Facebook and all your kind of friends and everything, like presumably it's your friends, but actually Facebook has all this data and you have no like good way to export it and use it in somewhere else, right? And so, and beyond that, power of governance, like we kind of, as a society, been moving in this direction of democracy. But even now, right, there's like very much not clear, transparent ways to, self-organize. There's very hard ways to actually enact change in the society. And I mean, we can talk about some of the specific cases that's happening in the world right now. But kind of putting it all together, right, what kind of these technologies in Web3 are allowing us to do is reimagine this, is to actually change kind of this ownership, control, governance parts and actually give them back to the person who initiated, who created, who is transacting. And that's really what we're after, right? Like, how do we achieve that? And so to achieve that, we need something that actually works for everyone, right? That is so simple to use, so scalable, and so secure as well, right? If we're talking about ownership and assets of people, that it's a no-brainer, right, to switch. And so that's kind of what we've been trying to build in the new ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah. And it's a really big vision. Clearly, part of that to me feels like a pushback on the way things are today in our kind of centralized society. And you kind of, hinted at it there with even if you happen to be lucky enough to be in a democratic society, doesn't necessarily mean that there's transparency and there could still be a lot of not so awesome things that are maybe happening. Talk a little bit about maybe what this is a pushback on or what you're trying, like where the motivation to build Near really comes from and what that's grounded in.
So I would say there are kind of two sides. There's a pragmatic side, which is, like some of our background is in AI, like my background is AI, and we're actually trying to build something else first. It was my co-founder, and we built a crowdsourcing system which needed to pay people. Like we wanted to pay people, and they were like around the world, like actually very global community we had there. And we just had trouble sending money from our US bank account to China, to Russia, to Ukraine, to Cuba, right, where we had some people working from. And so a lot of it kind of spanned from that is like there's always kind of this bottlenecks and limitations that actually hurting people, normal people more than actually, I mean, sometimes even the people that were supposed to, like who was they were supposed to, write the kind of people who are financing something or money laundering. On the other side, there's a systematic problem, which is kind of if you're a for-profit, big company, you are trying to become monopoly. This is just like the inevitable state of what you're trying to do. And so, and you kind of see that, like, so I worked at Google and I saw that kind of happening. I mean, I was somewhat late already, but you can see kind of Google's progression from this don't be evil, really trying to be on the right side, being very conscious about decisions they're making, and then over time starting to make more and more for-profit decisions because they see, Facebook is doing something like, oh, we should do that too, right? Like, oh, they're tracking user in this way. Well, we should do it too. And so like they actually kind of almost given up on some of the principles they themselves established originally, right? There was a huge disaggregation between different departments so to make sure the data is not getting leaked between and stuff like this. And so all that was kind of going away because there's, this motivation of generating more profit, of generating more revenue. And so like it's not like for me, it's not even about specific people who are running these companies. I think it's a systematic kind of a corporation approach that requires. And so if we don't want to live in that world where it's few companies that are monopolies, because compared to before tech, where there was a lot of kind of like there's multiple companies that could coexist and be like reasonably large and still like railways and others were still monopolies. In tech you can be monopoly like globally. There's no way to to take over that, right? And so what again Web3 is offering us is changing the model, right? Giving it back to the user, giving back the ownership to the user as well, and also motivating users to come in the first place through this. And so we have kind of for the first time an ability both to break these monopolies and also create something that is actually non-monopolizable in a way. And this is why, like for me, Web3 is not about decentralization. I think decentralization is just a tool. What it is about is low switching costs. Like if we actually achieve low switching costs, right, at every single level, like I as a user, as a company, as a project, as anything can switch reasonably with low switching costs, we are at kind of perfect competition in a way then, because everybody needs to compete all the time to be able to actually be the best place where people are running. And so and like you can see this like when we talk about validators, like on a protocol level, like the switching cost is low. Like new validators can come in, all can come out. With wallets, with RPCs, with with all of the stuff, you can always enter your seed phrase in another wallet, switch RPC endpoint. Like it doesn't matter that this specific wallet is centralized. It's the fact that you can switch to something else and it's really cheap for you. And so this wallet needs to be really good so you don't switch to something else. That's really kind of how I see this vision kind of coming. And like kind of going against some of the existing thing that is trying to really make switching costs like as expensive as possible or ideally impossible because they just buy everybody out who you would switch to. And so you don't have alternatives in the first place.
I think that's fascinating. I've never heard anyone talk about that. What Web3 is really about is lowering the barrier for switching costs, but it makes so much sense. And, I love the comparison there between in the current model, if you're running a company, you have, what's often called a profit motive, which obviously as you led to, especially with companies now competing on a global scale. Yeah, clearly the goal is to monopolize your entire industry and to do that not just in one market, but to do that around the world. And yeah, companies can try to do that in a positive way, but I think to your point, it comes with a lot of, kind of negative consequences. And so I love that idea. It's really compelling to almost build a new system, a new structure that one makes monopolies impossible, but also is, I think, creates a level playing field for competition, which honestly, for entrepreneurs, I think is incredibly positive. Like, talk about what that unlocks for builders and why that is such an important thing in Web3.
So I think kind of what happened in Web3, right? I'll just show you the examples because I think it's more powerful. The examples are Uniswap, which is a kind of exchange, decentralized exchange software, which was built by, one guy and then like a small team of this, was valued or is valued as like close to Coinbase price, right? Like to a centralized, huge, thousands of people company. And the reason is not because of the exchange itself, but because both it amassed kind of the adoption, but also a lot of other applications are using it. And they can use Uniswap the way they cannot use Coinbase. They cannot use, Nasdaq. They cannot build on top of it really easily, kind of extend it in ways that the original developers were not thinking is possible. But think about it. It's a decentralized exchange which run pretty much by like a team, like initially a team like a in my head out of a garage. I mean, they were probably in some apartment in New York, which runs something that's like worth billions of dollars in financial system. Can you imagine like ever anybody being able to rely on a financial system that's run out of a garage by a few folks? No, but in crypto you can because it's it's deterministic. It runs. It's open source, right? It even if this team goes away, but in any way, right, the system continues working, and that's kind of the benefits that Web3 provides is guarantees that it will be predictable in specific ways, right? It will predictably work. It will have specific ways to upgrade and change. It has, community and ownership distributed to the ecosystem. And so the both barrier to entry is very low, right? Like it can be built by, one or two people really easily. And you can have kind of this really big impact on this. And at the same time, somebody can fork it and build something else, right? It's not a zero sum. Right? SushiSwap can shown that they can, hey, like we can just fork this existing thing and expand from that. And so this is where the switching costs come in is like, yeah, You build something, it's amazing, but then low switching costs means somebody will be competing with you always. And so like for builders, it means you can start really easily. You can build on top of all those existing pieces and rely that they'll be there. Like if I'm as when I was doing Web2 startup, right, and we were like wanting to use some external service, we need to evaluate like how likely this service will go out of business in next whatever, like 6 months, 12 months. Here we don't need to, right? It's gonna be running. It has all the things there. And so kind of you have this like foundation that you can build on, and then you have this kind of constant competition as you build out. As you actually succeed, then you have a constant competition you need to kind of work against. But the barrier of entry is very low.
Yeah, the barrier is entry low, so it democratizes people's ability to start something and build something for the market and be able to see what that is. But it's also kind of Darwinian, I think, in a really positive sense of over time, the best solutions are always going to be the ones that are winning. And I love that, one way that I've kind of thought of Web 2 versus Web 3, and it goes to the heart of that example you just shared, is Web 2, as humans, I think a lot of times we're trying to rely on signaling from the companies to interpret who's good, who's bad, who's working well, how good is their technology. And with Web3, it's like there's certainly that. There's still people that are talking about a project or, advocating for it. But at the end of the day, you can also just go and look at the code base. You can go and look at, the actual nodes that are running. You can just look through to the core technology and, build confidence in that, which seems very, very, very different than kind of a Web2 world.
And you can also see all the usage as well, right? You can actually see every single like versus people telling you like, hey, we're making this much or we have this much users. You can like, hey, you actually have this much users or not.
Yeah. No, I mean, a classic way that might show up is like companies quoting logos of customers, and in Web3, it's like, just look at the data. Just you can see it right there. I'd love to talk for a little bit about your journey to build Near and a little bit of your crypto origin story. Can you kind of walk us back in time a little bit and talk about one, how you first became aware of crypto and got interested into it, and then, the journey from that to eventually building Near. And maybe those are really closely coupled, maybe those are further apart, but just walk us through your origin story and the kind of origin story of Near.
Yeah, I mean those are pretty coupled. I mentioned kind of my background in AI. I was in Google Research, working across a lot of natural language problems, and left to start Near AI, which was a teaching machines to code. We were trying to actually automate some of the parts of software engineering, and to do that, we needed a lot of data from actual developers, and so we built this kind of network of students, software engineering students around the world, where they would do a lot of tasks for us to generate this data. And so, kind of as we were realizing, let's just say that at that point, both technology and the scale at which we were operating was not enough to solve that problem. One of my co-authors just started a new startup working on a very similar dimension. So it's getting there. So we're just a little bit too early, for years early. And so we were thinking like, hey, we built this crowdsourcing system. It actually worked, and it was, high quality. We had like really good community of developers, kind of just students working on it. And so we started looking at like how can we like scale that up. And so that was the problem. Like we already were like, it was super manual process to send money because like, you need to do PayPal here, Pioneer there, wire transfer. Like on Cuba, you need to like convince them to like for them to have a Spanish passport to have a bank account in Spain or something, right? Like it was like a super complicated processes. And so we started looking at crypto. It's like, and obviously I've heard of crypto before. For me, proof of work always been kind of, I call it not natural. So like for me, natural state is optimization, is always trying to either do more with same energy or do same with less energy. And Bitcoin is, do same with more energy, the more successful you are. And so that always led me to kind of like this mental block. And so when I learned about proof of stake, which was a bit earlier, I'm like, oh yeah, that actually makes sense. And so when we kind of started diving in, we really went in to kind of study all the stuff that's going on, right? Like Ethereum, Bitcoin, obviously, we're not even close to be able, even back then, to be able to, this was like May 2018, to be able to power something that has like microtransactions, like sending, dollar to people. And they're like really hard to use. Like if you're trying to actually install Bitcoin wallet, it's still pretty hard. And back then, Ethereum also was super complicated. Like,
Much worse than today.
well, yeah, I mean, it improved a lot, to be clear. So, and so we then looked at a lot of other blockchains, and both the ones that were launching or the ones that were in development, and we did not find anything that actually like truly addressed the set of requirements that we had, right? Which is like something that's simple to use, simple to develop, right? As a developer, something that actually scales. You know, if we have like actual million users on it, like will we be paying like insane amounts of money? And it's actually like secure, you know, algorithmic secure. And like our background, both in, me and Alex have been in competitive programming, which is like design kind of, you know, trains your brain to always think in the worst case scenario. Like it's literally you kind of, you're writing some program that will be tested on worst case scenarios. And so, kind of just looking through a lot of the designs back then, none of them were actually withstanding that judgment. And so, we actually have done a YouTube series around that where we interviewed the protocols, like the founders and lead engineers of the protocols, and kind of asking them all those questions that we had, which has been pretty interesting for like a small audience of technical people who really want to know how all this stuff works. And so that's really kind of where we were. We were like, hey, there's nothing that actually satisfies our requirements, nothing that, designed for scale, right? There's a bunch of stuff that, that says we're going to run more stuff on one machine, right? So most of the protocols right now that actually scaling solutions, they are just saying like, hey, we're going to be more efficient on one computer, and the computer may be bigger. But that's not really, again, coming from Google, my co-founders from Single Store, which is like sharded database company, we're like, well, the only way to scale to billions of users is sharding. Like you cannot build big computers, well, fast enough at least. And so this is where we end up. We're like, hey, let's build a sharded blockchain that is actually developer friendly, that is designed for like kind of normal people. So we hide all the like, private keys, all the hashes, etc., from the user. We give developers way to build in JavaScript and Rust and all of those kind of normal programming languages. And we did design it with, our rigor of, we're going to break it. And if we break it, we need to fix it. And we're going to do that, which took us a little bit of time to figure out how to stop breaking our own ideas. That's really how we started. That was August 2018 when we kind of kicked off. We right away brought a bunch of our like ex-Google, ex-Facebook, ex-Single Store people and the team to really, start pushing this forward. And so, yeah, been almost 4 years now in the journey.
That's a fascinating story. And I want to go back at the end and talk about building amidst volatility and building in down markets in crypto. And obviously in 2018, you had a little bit of that.
We've had lots of experiences with that.
So we'll come back to that at the end, but there's a bunch of interesting threads I want to try to pull off on what you just said. And one of them is, when you talk about that, obviously with technology, the natural path is optimization. It just makes sense. When you talk about hiding all the complexity and also allowing people to basically build in whatever, native programming language that they know or that they want to work in, that just makes sense. And yet it seems very different than other protocols. Like a lot of crypto seems almost a little tribal in terms of it's this way and it can only work this way. Where do you think that comes from? And why aren't other projects being as intellectually, I don't know, honest? Or is it just that it's much harder and you guys have just chosen the harder path? How do you think about that?
I mean, it's combination. I think it is harder to some extent to do a lot of this stuff. Like our account model is, to design for user experience, you need to like actually make a more complex system underneath, right? And then hide it in such a way that people actually can understand it, right? Like making sure that languages work is actually super hard. I mean, kind of, for example, for Ethereum, this wasn't an option. There was actually nothing worked back then, and so they invented DVM, and that was kind of and like the thing about to understand is also you're kind of under constant pressure to actually launch, and so you don't always make good decisions because like you kind of need to execute faster, and so and then changing later is super complicated. And then a lot of people just replicated EVM. And so kind of in our case, we also did that, but we did that as just a smart contract, as something that's completely outside of the core protocol. So it actually runs and actually showcases how easy it is to develop on Near because you can take something else, some other blockchain, and just run it as a smart contract. Part of it is also, I think people view some of the use cases, but also decisions on what blockchain is for differently, right? Like in our case, we came from like, hey, we want to build end user like actual applications, right? Which are able to use by, so somebody did build in a community a crowdsourcing application called NearCrowd, which has like 2,000-3,000 daily active users, which are not technical. They are not engineers, they're not blockchain specialists. They're literally like people from factories and people who work at service industry in Philippines, and it's very kind of broad, non-technical, or like some kids like under 14, and there's like somebody's grandma was using it as well, and that's just not usually the kind of mental model that a lot of folks are designing for, and we were kind of designing for that. And so yeah, so a lot of it is just like people think, oh, smart contract developers should be, this elite kind of limited thing. So we will design a new programming language, for example, for them specifically. It's fine if there's only like 500 of them needed, they can learn the programming language. Which again, like we don't agree. Like we see this really as this like Cambrian explosion of experimentation on top because everybody can combine with everything, and so we want everyone to be able to do this. We want every single developer to be able to write smart code. Maybe they will not, maybe they reuse existing code, but then they need to be able to read existing code, right? And this goes into like, well, we want actually people to be able to read the code because that's what, the whole reliance on that is. And so, yeah, like how do we make it more kind of available is like a very different decision making, right, than some of the other protocols today.
Yeah, yeah. Sounds deeply rooted in I think your guys' values, which is very cool. And I love. It seems like you kind of hit on it at the end there, talking about what you're really going for is this Cambrian explosion. Which of course that totally makes sense. You're building an ecosystem. You're building, kind of a new reality that people can enter and they can build on. And so lowering the bar as much as possible so anyone can do it just makes a ton of sense. I'd love to talk now about some of the kind of goals you guys had with Near, and those three ones, at least that at a very high level, I find really appealing is focusing on being climate neutral, high speed and a low transaction fee layer one blockchain. And we've hinted on some of those. And so I'd love to kind of talk about those each. And maybe where we could start is piggybacking off sharding, because you guys have a really unique approach to sharding that obviously allows very high throughput. Talk about, maybe get a little bit technical into what's different about the way you guys approach sharding, and talk about why you did that and what that unlocks, what that, creates for Near.
For sure, yeah. So kind of there's a bunch of folks and still are who are understand that you cannot build a bigger machine to process all the transactions in the world. And so the way to solve that is, to run more stuff in parallel. And so there's kind of a spectrum from something like Cosmos, where you say, well, you can run your chain and I can run our chain, and they're completely independent and run stuff in parallel, and we're good, and we just have, hundreds of such chains, and that's how we scale. And then we have bridges and stuff, and we've seen some of this interesting stuff happening this week or last week about how that interacts, but kind of that's one model. Then there's a model which I will call rollups. There's a little bit like differences how this works, but it's this idea of, hey, we have kind of a common security model, so we all align on the security here, which might have helped with some of the situation that happened last week. But each kind of application or maybe set of applications have their own zone, app chain, rollup, parachain, call it C chain, whatever you want, right? There's so many names. Somebody on Twitter actually asked to like, hey guys, can you unify this?
No. The short answer is no.
And so the idea there is kind of on one side, like, hey, we scale, but we can, have a common security, so we are able to communicate between these things. And so how common security implemented is very different for different of this like rollups versus parachains. But the user experience is the same, is that you need to think as a user, where the hell are your funds? Where is the app? Are they on the same things, on different things? Can you move them? How long does it take? Like, are you going this way or this, like through the security level or like directly because there's some like other application to move it directly? Like there's so much complexity that user need to think about, right? And At least you don't need to think about security, which you do need in Cosmos, but it's still a lot of complexity on the user, right? And right now we see that, right? There's Arbitrum, there's Optimism, there's like multiple EVM chains in Polkadot ecosystem, and like you don't know, like you need to like look up which application, like which one is where, like, oh, is my wallet configured to the right thing, like switch, then move, bridge, etc. And so sharding kind of as a concept, I mean, all of this is sharding to be clear, but kind of general sharding concepts from Web2 is just like you shard kind of underneath the user, right? You don't expose user to the way you model your database. And so that's kind of where we've been aiming for. This is, to be clear, where ETH2 originally was planning to go. They have abandoned that path. And so, and at the same time, like there you have multiple ways to implement this, but at least the way we have, like we actually implemented multiple ways. And so this is the way that actually works. From a user perspective, from a developer perspective, it's one chain. You don't need to think about sharding. You don't need to think about like how things are happening under the hood. You have, blocks produced, you interact with smart contracts, you have wallet, you have one account, it's invisible for you. What underneath happens is that we actually shard the blocks. So we don't have multiple blockchains running in parallel, we actually shard blocks. And so because of this, we can actually change number of shards dynamically. So this is actually like in our roadmap, kind of probably toward end of this year, beginning of next year, is right now you need a governance to change the number of shards, but you can actually change this dynamically based on the demand. Like if there's some more demand, we can actually move some contracts and accounts to different shards and like allow them to have more capacity to process.
Seems very elegant.
Very complicated to implement, but
well,
yes.
yeah, everything elegant is very complicated.
Yeah, but it allows, to have like a very kind of straightforward model for the user. And so the example of this being when we actually changed, so we launched with one shard because, well, you didn't need more than one shard when you launch. And so we actually resharded to 4 shards through governance in November last year. And there's zero change to the user developer, right? Like literally you did not even notice something happened. Like it's still running. And the thing is, like we kind of even don't need to show it in tooling. Like if you want to see the shards, you actually need to like hit with like raw RPC calls to the, to get block information. Like on explorers, on wallets, etc., you don't see the shards at all because like it doesn't matter, right? And we probably like the layout will change, which shard you're on will change, all of this will change, like but none of it actually matters. So that's kind of how we've been kind of structuring this, and it is a very elegant design, which took us sadly a year to come to. We have this old papers we've published, which have 3 different designs before we got to this. But yeah, it allowed us to kind of already deliver this like capacity and also kind of continue expand as usage grows. But also kind of through that journey, we figured out how to have a very fast consensus, which is able to finalize blocks and actually finalize BFT finality in 2 seconds, kind of with 1 second blocks by really pipelining all of the communication and really speeding up what Tendermint with Cosmos is doing and kind of like Polkadot, Tendermint, and Ghost. They're all somewhat in the same space of BFT finality consensuses, and they all have this kind of a extra reliance on communication. And Doomslug, the near consensus, actually is doing everything pipelined, meaning the communication is always happening forward. And so by the time you produce next block, you already know that you finalized the last block because you received those approvals in when everything works correctly. And so that allows to kind of really fast track this.
Yeah. That sounds so cool. Hopefully that was not too technical. I know anytime we talk about sharding, it starts to get somewhat technical. I want to talk about one thing before we kind of move on to some of those other points. You mentioned there about governance, and maybe this is a good time to talk about why governance is important. And obviously I'll try to give a little bit of a preamble, and please feel free to add to that or kind of edit that. But you guys are a decentralized project, and we'll talk at the end about starting off how all projects generally start off centralized. At some point in time, they decide to become decentralized. That often comes with, obviously, members of your community being able to vote on governance issues. talk about like why the sharding was up for a vote and why it's important to allow your community to vote on things like that. And I know at some point you're going to move, it sounds like, to this dynamic, but I think it's an interest just because you brought it up and it's kind of interesting there. I think it'd be great to touch on it because for people who have voted on a governance issue before, which I think is a very, very, very small subset of people, you kind of get it. But there's a lot of people that I think hear governance and they don't really know what that means. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
For sure, yeah. So I'll tell a story of our launch instead. So our launch was actually uniquely done where the network was kind of brought up and given to validators, and then all the tokens were distributed and they were delegated, but they were not transferable. So nobody could transfer tokens. It was pretty much just like a kind of origin set. Validators run it around the world. And what needed to happen is validators and their delegates through the validators needed to vote to unlock the transfers, right? And so, and this kind of was designed for two reasons. One is like it was really to prove that the network runs on one side. And the second one is to show that validators and the community and token holders are able to make decisions, right? They're able to self-organize, make decisions. If our team, like chills out or whatever, like at that point, which was one team, this thing can continue running, right? The validators know how to communicate. There's all the channels, all the stuff is configured. And to be clear, like there was a huge setup to get there. Like there was a lot of, stake wars, which was done to organize all that. And so they voted, and there was a lot of back and forth. Like there's some tooling that wasn't ready. Some people were like, hey, we don't want to launch yet because it's not ready yet for the specific things. And some people are, no, we want to launch because, we want this token to be live and we want it to be like actually, exchangeable. And so that kind of, there was a little bit of a drama at that point. I mean, like for a brief second that happened, but like that was the process, right? Which allowed people to like express their opinion, communicate. Like some validators, for example, voted, and then their delegates, token holders who delegate to them, did not agree with their decision, and so they expressed that, and they forced them to switch their decision, and so you kind of so was like in a way it was an experiment, in a way like we needed to do that to launch the network. So you experimented broad, but that just showcases kind of both the power that the community is able to make decisions on the protocol. It's not a single team, even if there's a team that's building the code. Like there's community that is able to make decisions, that is able to enact them, and is able to like in a way potentially fork off this team and actually like choose a different team, or do something different. That's again important because like you don't want to rely on a single party, even if this party is me, to make decisions, because like there's all kinds of things from being not available to do the decisions to for some reason becoming malicious, right? And so it's important to have this power, and we kind of see that like in near ecosystem it's getting stronger and stronger through actually decentralization itself. And so what we have done since launch is we decentralized our team. A lot of the kind of what people were there before the launch actually left, and now we don't have that company anymore. So we kind of finalizing that process. So originally spun out Foundation, which is kind of really responsible for education, for funding in the ecosystem, for the decentralization regulatory work. We have Human Guild, which is responsible for gaming, and they really focused on kind of human part of the ecosystem. They have a really good community there. We have Proximity, that's focused on DeFi. We have OWC, which is an accelerator, which also kind of originally started, but spun out. And then we have near China and MetaVeb, the Eco Fund. We have near Ukraine, which is now in Portugal, a regional hub, and we have more and more of this kind of regional hubs like in Kenya, in Balkans, starting as well. And so really becoming like have strong teams present everywhere in the world, have very different opinions, have very different stakeholders themselves as well, and bringing these ideas right to the community, bringing them to kind of decision making is important, because at the end we're not trying to have like this monotonic culture. It's all about having everyone represented, having in all those places actual like getting people's their access and control over the data assets and governance. And so to do that, you need this kind of really rich and active community and like actually work on this. And so kind of part of it is like I call it osmosis, where like parts of the things are just like spun out and kind of grown on their own. And so that's been doing. And so kind of the left out of the team have also spun out into Pagoda, which is a Web3 startup platform really focused on like building all the tooling for Web3 startups. And so now like the original core team doesn't even exist kind of in the shape and form that like it started, because everybody is kind of in different places in the ecosystem.
Yeah, you covered a ton of ground there. I mean, I love the story you shared around literally having decentralization and governance show up from day one when you launch the project, because it's very cool, and it's a way, I think, from the very literally the first day that the protocol is going live, of saying, no, we deeply care about decentralization. We're going to start off actually with this kind of new novel approach, but we're doing it because we really believe in decentralization. And you hinted at it at the end, and I'd love to explore it a little bit more in detail of, for people that aren't familiar, every project starts out centralized, and what we mean by that is it's traditionally like yourself and your co-founder and the initial team. It's literally people just deciding to work on something together, and so they're self-organized. They basically form a small team. They obviously have a company. They might raise funding out of that company, but then there's a really interesting moment. Typically, it's around when the mainnet goes live or the protocol actually launches, where then basically the protocol is owned by a foundation, and the model changes from centralized control to very broad decentralization. You hinted at it there. I would love to talk about, from your perspective, how is your role changed when Near was centralized versus decentralized? And then, paint a picture for people. You talked about a lot of specific entities there, but just really broadly, what are you pushing down to these hubs? And talk about that hub approach, because I think it's very unique.
Yeah, I think kind of my role, I would say, went from, I obviously was kind of helping to architect the protocol, and then was helping to kind of set up like foundation and a lot of like fundraising, legal structure there, and then kind of organizing this community for launch. But over time, yeah, my role started to transition more into like how to help projects succeed on Near, right? So working more with projects, working more with newcomers who want to build something. And so part of kind of this more global idea, right, like of Web3 is, so I have this like very complex mind chart of how I think Web3 should develop with, I don't know, 100 boxes. And so each box is a component of Web3. It's everything from identity to, conflict resolution to reputation to, decentralized storage, etc. Right? So blockchain is one component there. And so really kind of in trying to work with teams to fill out this whole map, right? And there's dependencies, there's kind of interconnections, how they work with each other, etc. And so in a way it's like advising, but it's also like being there for kind of product, connecting them with other pieces of ecosystem, sometimes kind of helping incubate it, etc. And at the same time helping find leaders in different regions, right? So I do believe kind of crypto is especially needed in developing markets, right? I mean, I'm from Ukraine. Right now, Ukraine is crypto pretty much runs on crypto, but also LATAM, Southeast Asia, all of those places. And so, kind of the idea is to really find kind of strong leaders, people who are really excited, and then empower them, right? So it's not that hubs like report to foundation. They're actually independent companies which are working for their own incentives, but they have kind of percentage of their profits are repurposed for the ecosystem development, right? For community marketing and all the stuff. And so this is designed to have like this independent hubs around the world, which are kind of self-interested in success of this whole ecosystem, while still contributing to kind of this like lifting, the whole ecosystem as well. And so that allows to really both have local presence, very strong local presence. These people, are doing everything from, funds, like allocating funds to projects in the ecosystem. They're doing kind of their own product development. They're working with governments. They're working with regulators as well in those regions. And they also become in a way part of the governance, like this whole community governance, because they actually the most tapped in that region, right? So everybody comes to them to learn more about what's going on. And so in a way, this kind of, as you have validators, like who are, people who are more technical who are running this, you have these regional hubs who are more kind of tapped in into the ecosystem part. And so they become kind of the other pole. And in general, like when I think of governance, there's a lot of different stakeholders in the ecosystem, right? And so they all gets represented differently, but like as an individual you probably are parts and kind of here parts there, and so you want to have some kind of exposure, like as you delegate your vote, or you delegate, or kind of even information you consume, you have like this different connections. Now, yeah, my role is really about kind of advising projects, finding partnerships, as well as finding really amazing people around the world to kind of start some of these hubs and projects.
Yeah. So in some ways, you're just like any other contributor to the near ecosystem, but you're
Exactly,
also
yeah.
connective tissue between different projects, different people, different regions around the world. And I'm guessing people working on complementary stuff, where they should obviously be working together and collaborating.
Yeah, pretty much connecting people. That's like half of my Telegram is just connecting somebody to somebody and then trying to figure out how to escape that group. Uh,
Yeah, God only knows what your Telegram looks like. It's probably mildly overwhelming to say the least.
I've half hit the maximum groups in Telegram,
Wow. I
and
didn't even
so
know that was a
and
thing. So,
that is the thing. There's 5,000 groups, and then at
wow.
that point, Telegram auto nukes some of the groups because it overfills the thing. So.
Well, I'd love to go and talk about that mind map you have of Web3 because I haven't, even just in some of the things you threw out there, like conflict resolution, super interesting. I haven't heard anyone talk about that as a specific problem to be solved in Web3. But it obviously makes sense because what are you doing? I think it seems like your mind map probably answers the question. In Web3, if we're decentralized, we face different challenges, we face different problems. So, what are those different problems? And then, how do we want to bucket those and think about solving them? Can you spend a little bit more time walking us through some of the things in that mind map? And I think specifically what I'd be curious about is if you could just pull out some of the things that probably are non-obvious, like conflict resolution again is an example I find really interesting. I'm sure there's others there. What's on your mind map that people probably aren't thinking about?
So I'll just kind of explain the top of it was if we want to build kind of decentralized versions of many of the applications people use right now, kind of day to day, right? And this is, social, this is things like food delivery, this is things like, Uber, this is things like, GitHub, etc. Like what do we need to do? If you think of something like Uber or food delivery, it's actually kind of a common piece that underneath, and I call it gig protocol, right? It's really like matching somebody who wants to do some service and somebody who needs this service, right? And so what gig protocol is actually underneath is a reputation, right? And when something goes wrong, like you did not bring food, or you did bring food, but then somebody said you did not, is conflict resolution, right? Which then requires identity, like some form of identity. And obviously we don't want, kind of privacy leaking identity. We want, how do we privacy first identity? What does that look like? So we need, zero knowledge proving, proxy encryption, and all this kind of like, then you're getting into like more technical components. And so similarly, if we have social, right, the main component of social is social graph. This is something that should belong to the person, right? And it's actually a very complex problem because like you will not be putting your full social graph on a blockchain. It doesn't matter how scalable blockchain is, it's still not scalable enough. I mean, like it's just like security parameters wise. But there's other ways to do that. And so how do you do that? How do you do reputation? Reputation is probably, and especially like for me, it became actually more relevant in March because we started running this humanitarian fund for Ukraine, and we actually were working with a lot of volunteers, like over 5,000 volunteers Unchained Fund worked with, and some of them were not, stole stuff. Like, I mean, we knew we'll lose some percentage of money, but like, we did KYC, we did, kind of pinpointing them location, proof of location. We did, kind of background check via the government database. We did it, and we did like if somebody knew in already existing network, so like a kind of a relationship network. And so like all that obviously was very centralized, very privacy invasive, very not Web3, but it was needed to be done, right? And so as we think about it, like how do we actually build this, but in a way that truly decentralized and actually like privacy preserving.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I want to go back and talk about one other of the kind of core components of what you're building at Near that I think is really interesting. And it's the goal of being sustainable. You can talk about that as climate neutral. There's a bunch of different ways to frame that up. But, I think even just going back to your comment around proof of work, obviously from your perspective, you're always trying to be optimizing. So sure, that's naturally going to be a goal because the goal is to use as little power as you can. The goal is to try to build something that's sustainable where you're getting more out for the same or less power in as you described it. Talk a little bit more about how you've approached that problem and how you think about sustainability or climate neutrality when it comes to blockchain, because I think you have an interesting mental model there.
Yeah, I mean, so in general, this is kind of in the same vein of like this huge mental map, right? Is like we need all those things to be sustainable, period, right? Because like we have one planet. I mean, yeah, Elon Musk is working on getting us to the next one, but probably we
Earth is
still
better.
don't want to. Yeah, well, we don't want to fuck up this one
Yeah.
for sure. And so, how do we get there? Obviously, optimization is part of it, but also like ability to understand where things going, what like where are the waste, where are the kind of emissions, etc. So for us, like what Near can be is this platform that allows everyone to build application like sustainable applications. Right? So not just the application itself sustainable, but also applications that help other industries to be sustainable, right? But the first step is always like before trying to fix somebody else's problem, like make sure you're actually not part of the problem. And so this is why Near is carbon neutral. It's certified. It's working with South Pole to kind of offset all the emissions. And actually, the funny part is because proof of stake, the emissions of the validators are like I think only a percentage of the total emissions that kind of foundation is calculating. A lot more is coming from travel, uh, because like airplanes are actually bigger issue. And so, and this goes into like, well, how do we help, for example, airplanes to be more sustainable, right? What is this like? Well, obviously, we're not working on what are synthetic fuels, but we can actually track usage of synthetic fuels. There can be incentivization systems to do that. There can be like, for example, if you're using there's projects which use now crypto for booking tickets, maybe there's some offset automatic in that embedded and stuff like this, right? You can start building more and more tooling and concepts, making it easier for people to be sustainable and operate in a sustainable way without needing to kind of go out of their way while actually committing to some of these goals.
That's so cool. And so it sounds like, yeah, you're just thinking again, it seems like another example where you're truly thinking about it multidimensionally and you're working on, kind of sustainability at all levels, or at least the technology and the infrastructure and the value of trying to make sure that you're being sustainable at all of those levels, which is a really unique
Exactly, yeah.
approach. Yeah. I'd love to talk a little bit about kind of do a little bit of a retrospective and talk about the lessons you've learned building Near. You gave an example earlier on of, having 3 different designs of sharding before landing on the 4th design that you're actually moving forward with. And clearly, just, I don't know, just to focus on that for a second, at any company, so much of innovation and invention is just iteration. And so there's always that. But, I'd be curious just from your perspective, you've now been working on this since 2018. As you look back, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned that might be applicable to others building in crypto? And it may be people building in the Near ecosystem. It may be people building in other ecosystems. What have you learned that you think is worth passing on?
Well, I think there are 2 interesting pieces. One is build upgradability right away. So it's interesting because like the blockchain is usually this, people have this meme of immutability, and there's like, you launch an application and it's forever. And that's not true because like nothing is like staying there forever. Like we need things to evolve. And even Bitcoin, for whatever, slow speed it's evolving, it actually does. They're adding new features, they're doing stuff. And so doing an explicit way to do upgradability, some ways that allows people to do this and like with the community consent, with understanding how this works, with whatever mechanics you want and need, it's really important because otherwise you will need to add it later and it will suck. that And so within that, then just launch faster. So if you have upgradability, that means you can upgrade. I mean, if you can, like we call it sandboxing, like we're actually trying to build some tooling for that. So you can launch a smart contract, but actually sandboxed, it only can process some amount of money per day. So if nothing else, you can just insure sandbox. If the contract gets completely broken, you just insure sandbox for that, and then it locks automatically if something wrong outside of this norm. And so you can make it like kind of easier to launch. And so for us specifically, what we should have done is somewhere in April 19, we actually had an implementation with Tendermint. We had our kind of smart contracts running on Tendermint without sharding. And this was right in the moment where we realized our sharding we did implement was too complex. It was not something that made sense. And so we should have just gotten that to launch, right? That was not sharding. We did not like deliver on the promise of sharding, but it was a working blockchain that could have gotten us people to start building applications. And instead, we kind of launched in October 2020, right? So like over a year and a half later. And obviously, like a lot of stuff that to launch we needed to do, we just did it a bunch later, which we could have kind of started doing in parallel while still figuring out sharding, which we did, and then implemented it, and then kind of started figuring out how to launch only like in beginning of 2020. So generally, like there's if we're talking about Web3 blockchains, there's so much things to go into launch that are non-technical that try to make minimal thing technical. I mean, secure it obviously, but then launch it, because then you can actually parallelize your technical process of continuously improving it while already being in the market, while already being users, right? And in Web 2, it's like a normal thing that everybody says, but in Web 3, it feels like everybody kind of went completely like, it's complete waterfall, write a white paper that defines everything from day one, and then we go and build it forever, and then we launch it and it's beautiful. And it's like, well, no.
The rules of building stuff haven't changed. That still
Yeah,
is a
the rules
very
have
difficult
haven't
approach.
changed. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fascinating. I want to ask two closing questions. This has been a fascinating overview of what you're building at Near, and so many, the stories you've shared have been amazing. The first question that I wanted to ask was around, going back to something you mentioned earlier in the show. In 2018, you decide to found Near. You're in the middle of a crypto bear market. There's an enormous amount of volatility. And the reason I want to talk about this is not, that sometimes in markets things go down. That should be just an accepted universal maxim. Everyone understands that things are going to ebb and flow. But I think the reason it's interesting to talk about is we're all human. And at the end of the day, if you're building something and you feel like there's this existential threat, the market's going down, or there's this price volatility, or people are leaving, or there's uncertainty, that obviously can factor into your psychology and how you're feeling about what you're building. And so the question I want to ask, just really simply at a high level, is how do you personally handle fear and anxiety when you're building in crypto? And then a second is just advice, to yourself and other developers or builders listening about what to do now, because we're again in another moment in time in crypto where there's extreme volatility and it feels like an existential threat, at least to some people in some parts of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, we started thinking about blockchain in May, and then we started like in August, and we fundraised in I think like September or something, and October, and we closed our fundraise, and market went up a little bit. It's like pretty much every time we fundraise, one way or another, there's some market going down, and probably somebody needs to start trading on that. And then obviously, like actually, we were doing another fundraise in the beginning of 2020 when March 12th happened,
Another
which was
terrible
super
time.
interesting. Yeah, and so generally, like at this point, it's been so many times already that it's kind of like okay, fine. I think the the interesting thing that changed, right? Like in 18, so I talked with my ex colleagues at that point at Google, and when I said, well, we're doing blockchain now, they're like, what are you guys scamming now, people? That was kind of the thing. But then the same people are now invested in this. They are interested. They've suggested ideas and projects for sustainability as well, for example, or for using this with AI. And so like the reality is the shift has happened. The mentality is already there. So like, yeah, there's market volatility and there will be market volatility. I mean, the kind of the equity market is volatile as well. That doesn't mean like people stopped using Google or Facebook, or those companies stopped pretty much making billions of dollars. And like we see, by all metrics, like usage is there, people are there, more and more like really good Web2 people are coming as well. Like they are interested and they see the space as like, actually the next wave. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, keep calm and build on. That's really the,
Keep calm and build
that's,
on. I like
yeah.
it. I haven't heard that exact
Uh,
phrasing.
that's, yeah, I posted that too. Like we have this chat with a lot of like near ecosystem founders. So this is what I posted to them.
Well, and I like your story because I think it touches on another aspect of what I felt, which is just there is no words that are going to comfort you, and part of it is just living through it and continuing to build, and hopefully over time you get desensitized. Maybe desensitized is not the most positive word or is not the right word, but it kind of feels accurate. It's just over time you stop caring about it less.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's the same as, if you're a VC, you cannot like this is, I mean, this is may sound bad, but like as a VC, you cannot attach to any single company, right? You cannot be like, hey, oh, this company, is like you try to help them, you try to sell them, but if some of them go to business, like that's normal, that's part of your kind of strategy, portfolio strategy. Similarly, here in crypto, if you're in crypto and you're Web3 and you believe in this like ideas and vision, like the kind of short-term price fluctuations, right? However they are, is they're not affecting you because you're looking for a long term, right? That's your strategy, and so who they do affect is people who came on to make short money for a period of time, right? And like in this sense, like this is why it's actually like in 2018 and beginning of 19 was actually pretty good because the market was actually pretty empty. Like there was only a few teams building, and so from this perspective, yeah, right now is like, and we welcome, by the way, every founder who wants to build right now something, and we have funding to help them. We have eco funds, we have partnerships with VCs as well, because like all of those VCs do have billions of dollars of raised funds to actually deploy capital into seed rounds and kind of Series A. So, build on.
And I love too as well too because both from venture capitalist perspective, who always talk about you want to do the counter cyclical thing, and investing you always want to go against the grain. Same thing with building, and so it's one of but it's so much harder to do than to say or to think, and so it's always when is the best time to build and when is the best time to invest. It's always in moments like this where there's a massive amount of uncertainty and there's people leaving. I want to talk about your humanitarian aid project. For a couple of reasons. Obviously, number one, you're Ukrainian by background. There's a terrible war going on in Ukraine. You decide to start this humanitarian, effort. Talk about, I think, just your perspective as a Ukrainian, why this was important and what you're trying to do with the foundation and how people can get involved.
Yeah, so it's called Unchained Fund, Unchained.fund. And so kind of when the war just started, first reaction, obviously call everyone make sure they're safe, try to figure out how to get them out. Second reaction is like, well, how can I help, right? I was like in New York. I'm like, I'm not gonna go fight with a rifle. Like, there's better ways I can contribute. So, first reaction was sending some money, and so it's war. It's happening right now. It is unclear if like the Kiev was pretty much under attack, so you don't know actually if the banking system will work because it may actually be bombarded out. And so crypto makes total sense as a way to send donations and help people. And so kind of the first thing I did was just sending whatever, how many Bitcoins I have to this Come Back Alive fund, which is an existing NGO that's been helping people for like a long time. And then you're like, okay, what else can I do, right? And to be clear, like there was only one who had Bitcoin address at all, right? Like none of the other things had it. And so one of our actually folks from ecosystem who's building Atlantis World, he reached out saying like, hey, we're thinking to do a kind of crypto fund, right? Like just collect funds and then distribute them to other NGOs, right? Just like be this place where people can send funds to, and then we just convert them into the NGOs. And so that's how it started, right? Like I joined and kind of we started collecting funds, and then we kind of evaluated NGOs and realized that those NGOs are very inefficient. They're not able to kind of really get on the ground. Like they have no reporting. Like their reporting is once a year, and so you need to wait for like a year to get reports from them. And so we're like, hey, we collected this money, we're responsible for that. We cannot give it to this fund, which like potentially was raised 50%, and then the report will be in 2023. And then like we have no idea how fast they'll be able to deploy capital. And so instead we started working directly with volunteers, because they were like, there's a whole network of crypto enthusiasts and crypto founders, and like they started referring people, and then we kind of created a process around that and built kind of CRM system with all the stuff that you usually do. And so kind of generally, like, the on one side, obviously I'm just, it's good to be helpful and be able to help and be able to kind of, also a lot of people then will reach out to me saying like, hey, how can we help? And I'm like, well, here's actually a list of things you can donate to, for example. Also, here's the things we need to buy. Right, there was all kinds of equipment, all kinds of generators and stuff like this, which like became hard to get. So if you can find places to buy it, we actually got like a bunch of equipment to Nikolaev. We got a bunch of, which was surrounded. We got a bunch of equipment to, we got a bunch of medicine to a place that was completely overtaken. And so, like, that was kind of, important work to be done. But at the same time, crypto was fundamental because we can actually move really quickly, right? It was done, 20 minutes. We had, a way to start collecting funds. First day, we already had 1 million. It's over 10 million at this point. And so, yeah, I think this is the future of NGOs in general, and like this, and specifically disaster relief. I think disaster relief is especially like, hey, deploy kind of a short-lived kind of team plus, lots of software to kind of orchestrate this. Volunteers on the ground, finding, collected, and distributed. And then I think the next stage here is really turning. I mean, there's some interesting stuff there, which is like a UBI program right now with women, with children under 6. There's like 10,000 women right now who getting like 25 euro per week. But then going beyond this is actually starting to build for-profit projects to rebuild. So actually like create investment DAOs that are able to rebuild buildings, rebuild infrastructure with expected returns, to really kind of align incentives and fund and kind of get money into the ecosystem of Ukraine, and in turn actually make Ukraine probably the capital of crypto as well, because it's already kind of been spurring there.
I think that would be an incredible outcome. So thank you for doing that. And as you mentioned, anyone who wants to donate or wants to learn more, you can go to unchained.fund. Thank you for doing that. I think it's a really cool and it's a really important project. And yes, to your point, I think especially for moments like this, it's about speed. It's about actually getting it to where it counts. So the traditional model, I think in a lot of ways, it goes to the things we've been talking about around what's, the kind of cons of a centralized model. And again, an example of what you can do by just taking that and almost deconstructing it and building it back up in a decentralized way. There's so many more questions I could ask you, Illia, but I want to be respectful of your time. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk. It's been so much fun to be able to kind of go through all this. Everyone listening and watching can learn more about Near at near.org or by following Near Protocol on Twitter. And if you're a developer listening, you can jump in and learn more in Near's developer docs at docs.near.org. Is there anything else you would call people's attention to, or any other ways you would direct people to go if they want to get involved in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I think near.chat for our Discord and near.org/grants if you need funding to build something in your ecosystem.
Near.chat is awesome. I didn't even know that existed. Thank you so much, Illia.
Thank you.